On today's episode of things you actually don't need for your garden, but people have convinced you need for your garden, tomato fertilizers. Let's go. This season, we're proud to partner with Advancing Eco-Agriculture, providing regenerative solutions for growers, and greencoverseed.com. Hey guys, it's Bree here at Blossom and Branch Farm, and it is the 4th of July, and today I'm going to be revealing the results of a little experiment I did with tomatoes, and we're going to be talking about how you can utilize that experiment to help your tomatoes this season. I talk a lot about soil health and why the garden industry has got a lot of us hoodwinked into thinking we have to spend a lot of money and buy a lot of stuff to make our gardens healthy, but it's just not the case. And today I'm talking specifically about tomato fertilizers, because we could walk down the aisle at any given garden center or big box store and find a bunch of boxes and bags and bottles labeled tomato fertilizer. Usually these have a mix of nitrogen, pretty high in phosphorus typically, and potassium. So why do I say that they're not really needed? Well, a lot of what we talk about here on this channel is soil health. I talk a lot about organic matter and fertilizers and all that kind of good stuff around here, and how you should really only be applying what you need to your soil and nothing more. There are a lot of people out there who make a commission off of selling you fertilizer. Phosphorus is the example that I'm going to use because it's the one that is most often found in the higher quantities in tomato fertilizers. It's also what's usually recommended for getting more tomatoes. And while yes, phosphorus is important for plant development, typically most soils have sufficient phosphorus, especially if you're following those soil health practices that we mentioned. There's phosphorus cycling happening in the soil. Now, of course, containers are a little bit of a different animal here, because our containers typically don't have the same soil interactions, the same microbial life available as, for example, an in-ground bed or even a raised bed that has contact with soil that is on the ground. So if you have an open bottom bed, everything that we're talking about here still applies. If you have a container, that's a situation where you may need to be adding some additional nutrients like tomato fertilizer, but not every week. That's way overkill. So in general, I always say soil test your soil once every few years, right? It doesn't have to be every year. I think that's overkill personally, because soil changes are generally pretty slow. So if we're doing it once every few years and we're doing a Haney test, I'll link that video below as well, then you're gonna have a pretty good idea of what your soil needs, but more importantly, what it doesn't need. So this comes into play when we're talking about phosphorus, because most soils in North America have sufficient levels of phosphorus already. What happens though with phosphorus is that it can be kind of hard for the plants to unlock. So while there can be phosphorus in the soil, it's not all available for your plants immediately. So that's where we get a little bit confused and where people start to add phosphorus. What does help to unlock phosphorus in the soil? We talked before on this channel a lot about rhizophagy and how the plants will actually put out exudates through their roots that are designed to help balance what they need at any given time. So for example, if a plant says, okay, I need phosphorus, it'll send out root exudates that are designed to help increase the mycorrhizal associations, and those mycorrhiza actually help go out and they form a little webby network, and they infect the root, and they form a little network, and they go out and they get phosphorus, and they help that plant get the phosphorus that is in the soil by extending their web of nutrient catching. So that is one way that the plants are able to get phosphorus. Another is that over time, phosphorus unlocks in the soil. So while it's not all immediately available at once, over the years, it slowly becomes more available. So by having the correct bacteria, so by having a good mix of healthy soil life, bacteria, fungi in the soil, by practicing those soil practices that we've talked about already, that's how you're going to be able to unlock the phosphorus that's already in your soil. Now, what happens if we start adding tomato fertilizers? So if we start using high phosphorus fertilizers every week or even every month during the growing season, and we already have phosphorus in our soil, that's actually going to impact the plant's ability to form those associations with the mycorrhiza. So you're going to end up accumulating a bunch of phosphorus in your soil, which can lead to things like iron deficiencies and calcium deficiencies. So, which can actually be much more detrimental than, for example, a slightly lower phosphorus level. So get your soil tested. If you haven't ever done it before, I have a video below. I'll link the video below about soil testing and the one that I recommend. But if you don't want to go through soil testing and you're not sure, don't just add stuff willy-nilly to your soil. Okay, the one thing that I always say, yeah, you could probably add a little bit of this every season, is nitrogen, which is why in this video we talk about loam, we talk about alfalfa. and we'll get into kind of our results on both of those. But you also don't want to over fertilize with nitrogen, because if you over fertilize with nitrogen, you're going to get a bunch of leaves and not, you know, really huge bushy plants and maybe not necessarily as many fruits, or you're going to be constantly having to prune off suckers. So balance is always key. If you are following the things that we talk about on this channel in terms of regenerative growing, so cover cropping, mulching, keeping your soil covered, limiting soil disturbance, limiting synthetic fertilizers, working with your native soil, and inoculating your seeds before you plant, you're already going to be doing the things that are going to help unlock your soil's potential already versus having to buy in a bunch of stuff. Okay, that's my rant on tomato fertilizers. Now let's go look at, because I did do a side-by-side test with wool pellets and alfalfa to give my plants a little bit of nitrogen. So let's go take a look at how those did. All right. The one thing that most soils need year over year is nitrogen. In one of my more recent videos, I talked about different nitrogen sources and how I like to use one that has organic matter. So versus just always using one that is liquid based and doesn't have any bulk to it, I prefer to use something that has a little bit of organic matter. You can go back and watch that video to learn why. That doesn't mean that I don't use some liquid fertilizers throughout the season. I use a lot of the products from Advancing Eco Agriculture, which have a lot of microbes. They're kelp-based, fish emulsion, they're still organic, but I already have a lot of organic matter in my soil. Contrast that with if you're adding a liquid fertilizer to soil that is low in organic matter, you're not going to be doing much for the soil life if you're just doing that. So we need that organic matter because that helps feed the soil microbes. That's why we talk a lot around here about things like cover crops. Cover crops, guys, is always going to be your best option. You can go back and watch our cover cropping videos about that. You can also undercrop your tomatoes. That means your tomatoes are actively growing and you have an undercrop growing underneath them of a cover crop, because I know it's always the timing issue that gets confusing. We talk more about all of this in our cover cropping class. And those things, just in and of themselves, are going to help create an environment that is going to help things like bacteria and mycorrhizal fungi thrive. Now, all that to say, the soil where I plant my tomatoes is a little bit lower in organic matter. It hasn't had a cover crop on it. So again, lower in organic matter. I wanted to use a fertilizer that had some bulk to it. So what I did was side-by-side comparison. Half of the tomatoes, I used wool pellets. You might have heard me talk about using wool in growing. If not, I'll put those videos down below too, but I use it in seed starting, and I also use it when I plant out into the ground, because not only do we have a lot of wool from our sheep, wool is also a great slow release nitrogen source, and it helps with moisture retention in the soil. So it helps improve the soil texture, it helps with moisture retention, it's a slow release nitrogen, and it's not going to burn the plant. So I did a side-by-side using that, and then also using our alfalfa fertilizer recipe, which uses alfalfa pellets just from the feed store. They're both good options. So it kind of comes down to which one is the most available to you. But I did want to see, okay, which one does better? Because of course, as gardeners, we always want our efforts to be worthwhile, right? If I'm going to fertilize, I want to fertilize with the best possible option. So let's take a look at the results now that I've done all that talking. And I'm going to actually even measure these tomatoes so that we can have a good average of how each one is doing. Hey, boys. Well, good morning, sirs. How are you this fine morning? They've been doing really well living with the chickens, except one of our chickens accidentally turned out to be a rooster. All right, so I trellis my tomatoes up on this. This is actually an old fence. We've got these 2x4s, and from the 2x4s, I use this cotton clothesline because I bury these actually in the soil. So when I'm planting my tomatoes, you can see that this wraps around and it goes all the way down, and actually I buried it underneath the roots. So when I planted these tomatoes, I went ahead and set this twine. Just use what you have. You could also use hemp. Jute to me doesn't last usually a full season, but hemp twine for me usually will. So let's go ahead and give these a measure. First, let's step back and maybe just take a look at them. Now, I do have a lot of lavender growing. I do like to have some, some flowering stuff growing near the tomatoes. But these ones here, so we've got 1, 2, 3. These are all the ones that we did with the wool. You can see they're pretty tall and thick and happy. Here's another one with the wool. I do need to prune these suckers, and I'll show that here at the end of this video. And then over here, we've got the ones that are grown with the alfalfa. Now, just from my visual observation, I know for you guys, it might be hard to discern, but to me, there's a difference in height and possibly a difference in fruit set. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and measure the height of each of these plants on the main leader, and then I'll go along and I'll do an average, and then I'm also gonna count fruit set. Yes, sir, I hear you. Okay, so the plants grown with wool right now are an average of 35.33 inches tall, and they have an average of 3.83 fruiting stems on them. Let's go take a look at the ones grown with the alfalfa fertilizer. If you didn't put some fertilizer in, I would recommend it's not too late. You can dig around the roots, scratch some in. I'll show what that looks like with the wool. Okay, already 2. Okay, so the ones grown with alfalfa fertilizer are an average of 31.5 inches tall. So that's, to me, a significant difference, significant enough that it matters. But let me count the fruit set. About the same amount in terms of fruit set. So taller plants, a little bit sturdier and bulkier with the wool than with the alfalfa, but fruit set, I would say on average, is pretty similar. Now the fruits on the ones grown with the wool are a little bit larger. Okay, so what's the conclusion here? Because I know you guys just want me to get to the point. I would say if you have the wool pellets, do it. Use the wool. These plants, to me visually, the ones with the wool look healthy. Again, it helps with the moisture retention. That's not to say that the alfalfa is a bad option. I use the alfalfa fertilizer quite regularly because it is more affordable, especially if you're doing a lot of space. The alfalfa is going to be cheaper for you than the wool. If you have wool pellets, that's great. I'll link some below, a source for some wool pellets. We actually have our wool that we happened to just shear off of our sheep. So I'm just gonna grab some raw wool, literally just off the sheep. Sometimes you can find this on Etsy. I find it's the best to bury it into the soil. You can mulch with it and use this as what's sitting on top, but I don't find you get as much nitrogen from that as you do just soil mulching benefits. So it'll help with weed prevention and moisture retention, but not so much with providing nitrogen immediately if you mulch on top of the soil with it. So instead, we're gonna go ahead and bury it. So if you're using wool pellets, you can kind of do the same thing. And I put about 3 tablespoons of wool pellets into each of these planting holes and about the same amount of alfalfa. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna dig down a little bit adjacent to my roots. I'm gonna pull off some of this wool, pop it into the hole, bury it. The deeper down you go, the better with tomatoes because they do have fairly deep roots. I'm gonna do the same thing on the other side. So I'm digging down. So again, ideally, in an ideal world, you've put these wool pellets or this alfalfa into the planting hole at planting time. But ideal world and reality don't always link up, as we know. And so if that's the case for you, it is absolutely fine to go ahead and go in now, scratch some wool pellets or some alfalfa fertilizer down into that soil. I'm gonna link the alfalfa fertilizer recipe below. I'll link the wool pellets below. Pruning suckers is not a necessity. It's not like if you don't prune your suckers, you're gonna have bad tomatoes. It's a personal thing. You don't have to do it if you don't want to. But what I don't like is when my tomatoes start falling over onto the ground and then things eat them and then the bugs get to them. So I do like to try to keep them trellis, and to me that is training them to one main sprout, one main shoot here. But you can see I have a pretty big side shoot growing here. So I'll just take that off, take that one off, take that one off, take that one off. And then I'm just gonna wind up my cotton. And if you didn't bury a cotton clothesline in and you're like, oh shoot, now I can't, you could always tie one loosely around the base. I'll show that here. If you can set up some kind of support or some kind of trellis system, you could use maybe electrical metal conduit and build one. Then it's not too late to trellis your tomato. You can tie some cotton clothesline around it and then just trellis it right up. All right, let's keep going. I usually just throw these, if they're a nice healthy growth, I just kind of toss it on the ground That's organic matter, so we'll just let those leaves sit down there on the ground and decompose. Now I've got all of my Sun Gold tomatoes trellised up and suckers pruned. Now that to say, I did want to mention Sun Golds are indeterminate tomatoes. That means that they are going to continue to fruit and produce tomatoes all season. Compared to my Romas over here, which are determinate tomatoes, that means they're going to basically have one big flush of tomatoes that I'm going to use for things like canning, stews, freezing. They're going to stay a little bit shrubbier, and to me it does not matter as much if these start to go on the ground, because again, they're not going to be producing all season like my indeterminates are. So for these ones, I'm still going to trellis them, but I'm not going to be so worried about pruning off the suckers. If you can just put like a T-post here, so say you didn't have a fence post, but you could do a T-post, then you could tie off a rope to that T-post, and then you're going to go on this side of this tomato, this side of this tomato, all the way down. So you're creating a structure, and then you do another one coming in front and wrapping behind. I hope that makes sense, but it's called the Florida weave. So that's another way that you could support these. If you don't have a top hanging trellis to hang from, you could put in 2 T-posts flanking your tomatoes and weave around them. Let's take a quick peek around what's happening here at the farm. We've got our first dahlias actually blooming, and because we overwinter them, they're blooming pretty early for us. We've got our echinacea blooming here. First dahlias. Hello. Hello, hello, hello. Some little baby Veronicas. These just got planted this year, so they'll be a little short here for the first year, and then they'll lengthen out. Some borage. Mostly that just reseeds itself and I don't stop it. Tons of feverfew. The delphinium, the yarrow starting to bloom. Our oregano is getting ready to bloom. I'd grow a couple types. I'll do a separate video on fillers here because I always get questions about filler flowers. But this is one of my favorite fillers, which is oregano. This is a lighter green called Drops of Jupiter. More feverfew. So full and lush. Oh, we've got our New Jersey tea down here. Here's some zinnias that we seeded last week, just starting to come up, that we seeded into our cover crop here. So this was a cover crop of hairy vetch that we terminated, and then we just plant our seeds right into there, and you can see they're coming up quite nicely. I'll give them a quick water. And then here we've got New Jersey tea. I love this plant. Look at all these native bees on here. This is a native plant. Great alternative to like a butterfly bush, which is invasive. This is native, and you can use the leaves as tea. So back when the colonists first came over, they found that the leaves of the New Jersey tea taste pretty similar to regular tea that they were used to. And so that's why it's called New Jersey tea. All right, guys, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video about tomato fertilizers, and hopefully it helped convince you to spend a little less money in your garden this summer. And let me know what you guys want to see next. We'll see you around here next time at the farm.